Since June of 1986, C-SPAN 2 has provided nationwide audiences with live coverage of the United States Senate and an inside look at the democratic process. If you have a question or comment about our networks, please write us at the C-SPAN Networks, 444 North Capitol Street, Northwest, Suite number 412, Washington, D.C., 20001.
Coming up next, coverage of a public affairs symposium sponsored by B'nai B'rith. The topic is the danger of chemical and biological weapons in the Middle East. In this session, we hear from Gary Thatcher, a reporter for the Christian Science Monitor. The title of his address is New Frontiers of Horror.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Sanford Hollander, the B'nai B'rith chairman of its UN committee, and I would like to welcome you to this very important symposium on the danger of chemical and biological weapons in the Middle East. Initially, I would like to introduce Seymour Reich, the international president of B'nai B'rith, to give you some words of welcome. Seymour.
Thank you, Sandy. Good morning. I'd like to, if I may, tell you what that B'nai B'rith sign back there means, and just to put this symposium into perspective. B'nai B'rith, which means Children of the Covenant, is the oldest Jewish organization in the world. We were formed 146 years ago, and are heading into the 21st century with a presence in 42 countries with 500,000 members, men, women, people on college campuses, teenagers. Many activities we engage in B'nai B'rith, from our Anti-Defamation League to our International Council, to our Political Action Network, to our Continuing Jewish Education, our Israel Commission, our book club and lecture series. And this symposium is one of a series of such activities that B'nai B'rith is engaged in. A few months ago, before the election and then again after it, we had a symposium on the election process and the impact upon the Jewish vote and the American people. Prior to that, we had a discussion on the pros and cons of an international peace conference dealing with problems in the Middle East. So we try to be relevant and current and deal with subjects of concern at the time. This morning, in holding this all-day symposium on the danger of chemical and biological weapons in the Middle East, B'nai B'rith becomes, I believe, the first Jewish organization to elevate this issue to such importance. We hold it at a time when both the CIA and the Pentagon are warning that with the introduction and development of these weapons in the Middle East, the balance of power and the danger of war has begun to shift and to come about in the Middle East. Moreover, we hold it at a time when experts are now acknowledging that these weapons also have a potential terrorist use, something that will be thoroughly explored and analyzed by Neil Livingston and Joe Douglas, the recognized authorities in the field who will be joining us later. Chemical weapons were used in World War I, but a 1925 Geneva Convention banned them. Despite that ban, they were used by Mussolini in Abyssinia, by Nasser in Yemen, by the Soviets in Afghanistan, and some would say by the United States in Vietnam. It took the 8-year Iran-Iraq war, representing the first wholesale use of chemical weapons since the trenches of the First World War, to call world attention to this growing danger. With the Persian Gulf conflict, the beast of chemical and biological weapons is not only loose again, but with new technology, it is bigger and more ferocious than ever. We now stand on the precipice of new frontiers of horror, new generations of chemical and particularly biological weapons that could threaten the whole populations and ultimately even life on this planet. Today, most of the nations developing chemical and biological weapons capability are in the Middle East. With the viability and the combustibility of this region and the ever-present potential for the superpowers to be drawn in, we need to be concerned about the spread of these weapons and their future technology in the Middle East. Libya today purportedly has the largest chemical weapon plant in the world, with a production capacity far exceeding any conceivable military use by Libya alone. Syria, Iraq, Iran, as well as Egypt, are developing chemical and biological weapon capabilities. And Syria and Iraq, two of Israel's most implacable foes, have the Scud missile systems to deliver these terrifying weapons not only to Jerusalem, but to Cairo as well. The Saudis have the Chinese East missiles, and they are also able to reach any target in the Middle East or Southern Europe. Even if they are not used against population centers, their use on the battlefield could be devastating and decisive. Not only could they devastate an advancing army, but those soldiers with protective gears would lose 40% of the military capability and 100% over time. Troop movements could be paralyzed through widespread contamination of terrain. Airfields could be neutralized. Chemical and biological weapons are called the poor man's nuclear weapons because they are easy and cheap to make. But their use could also make the use of nuclear weapons more likely in a Middle East conflict, something America's defense and political establishment are deeply concerned about. A convention was recently held in Paris in February to deal with this issue. It was a convention based on consensus, and where that convention goes remains to be seen. A report in the newspaper just the other day indicated that a factory in Florida was capable and in fact was exporting chemical weapons to Iran and probably even to Libya. And indeed, when I met with Chancellor Kohl just 2 weeks ago in Bonn, and he indicated to me the concern about chemical weapons and the exportation of same and the introduction of legislation which might even test the constitutionality within the West German structure of states and federal laws, the Chancellor was indeed pointing out that there were cynics out there because many other countries have been engaging in this process, and he pointedly referred to Florida, which was not then known or in the public eye. In Tampa, a factory engaged in this process. The Kurds wiped out a whole village. A whole Kurdish village was wiped out, I mean to say, without nary an outcry by the West. It made the newspapers for a day or a day and a half, and then it disappeared from the scene. And one wonders why Israel, we understand why Israel recognizes that guarantees of nations really are not effective when it comes to chemical weapons, to biological weapons, or even to guarantees in terms of secure borders. And the state of Israel, like other states, want to rely on their own resources rather than the guarantees of others. So the objective of this symposium is to educate the community and the public at large to the danger of those weapons in the Middle East and elsewhere. As our program says, the beast is loose. We will hear from a number of expert speakers representing a range of political and military viewpoints, beginning with Gary Thatcher, the Christian Science Minister, and individuals from the Washington Institute on Near East Policy, terrorism experts Neil Livingston and Joseph Douglas. We hope that today's proceedings, that the world will understand this danger a bit better, and that it will have a somewhat better idea about how to get that beast back into the cage. So this, for us, and hopefully for you, is an important session, an issue that the people throughout the world are concerned about. The question is whether we can handle it, whether we can restrain it, whether we can bring it under control, and whether we can, as I said, put that beast back into the cage. Thank you.
Thank you, Seymour, for setting the tone for this symposium. Thomas Newman, the Executive Vice President of the B'nai B'rith, had hoped that he would be with us today, but unfortunately he has been detained out of town. Dan Mariashin, the Director of Public Affairs for B'nai B'rith, would like to welcome you on behalf of this organization.
We're indeed pleased that all of you are here today for this symposium, and as you can tell from the attendance list, which we hope that each of you has, we have assembled not only an expert group of speakers, but an expert audience as well. That was our intention, and we're glad that you can join us for this important day on this important subject. This is the first of what the Public Affairs Department of B'nai B'rith hopes will be a number of such meetings on issues of topical and timely interest. We hope that all of you will join us at some future date. You know, when you attend a meeting like this, you get put on a mailing list, and so you'll be hearing from us. We're currently planning a symposium for this fall on U.S.-Latin American relations, the date and time of which will be announced soon. The Public Affairs Department of B'nai B'rith was established a little over a year ago and has incorporated into it the International Council of B'nai B'rith, which brings together representatives of B'nai B'rith lodges and units, leadership in 42 countries, as Mr. Reich indicated, most recently in the USSR. It also incorporates our UN office in New York, which is the major Jewish NGO office associated with the United Nations, a UN office in Geneva, which focuses full-time on human rights issues, the Political Action Network, an educational organization focusing on domestic and international political issues, and the B'nai B'rith World Center in Jerusalem. Most recently, the Public Affairs Department has been actively involved in establishing cultural programs for the Jewish community in the USSR, was instrumental in the effort to attain ratification of the Genocide Treaty, and has been involved deeply with the issue of Latin American debt and the question of international terrorism. We have a number of publications that we distribute. We have a monograph series that I would like to bring to your attention, and hope now that all of you will be receiving our monographs, the most recent of which is entitled Eastern Europe, the Challenge of the Gorbachev Era, and it's authored by George Spector, whom I'll introduce in a moment. These monographs are issued periodically on major issues, and we hope in the coming year to publish at least 2 of those. I want to take a moment to give credit where credit is due to the individual who really put this symposium together, not only from an administrative point of view, but really from a substantive point of view. He's taken a great deal of interest in this issue, and that is George Spector, who is Associate Director of the International Council of B'nai B'rith. And I'd like to call on George for just a moment before we get underway to say a few words.
Thank you, Dan. I just want to say a very few words of greetings. I think the timing of this symposium is obviously important. It comes just weeks after CIA Director Webster testified to Congress that the balance of power in the Middle East does seem to be shifting. It's an issue of concern not only for the Middle East but for the world generally, and I think we can look forward to a very interesting, provocative, and stimulating program today. Thank you.
As happens sometimes in these programs, people do not arrive at the times that we anticipate them, and Gary Thatcher is a little bit delayed, so that what I'm going to do is I'm going to deviate a little in the program and move to, if you look on your agenda, to the 10:30 piece where it says the Middle East, the beast is loose, and I would like to introduce to you at this time Dr. Seth Karras. Dr. Seth Karras is a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he follows military developments in the Middle East. He's the author of numerous articles and monographs on the subject, including papers published by the Washington Institute on chemical weapons in the Middle East and missiles in the Middle East, a new threat to stability. He earned his Ph.D. in international relations from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore in 1987. Prior to that, he was the senior military analyst at the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee. Will you please welcome Dr. Seth Karras?
What I'm going to try to do in the next couple of minutes is essentially survey where things stand at the moment in the Middle East. For those of you who have already heard this before, I apologize, but I think it's useful to sort of lay the foundation, the factual basis from which the subsequent discussion is going to be based. In addition, I'm going to spend some time looking in particular at an issue which I think is of concern to this organization, which is the whole issue of how chemical weapons impact on the Arab-Israeli military balance. Now, looking at the problem of chemical proliferation in the Middle East, we find that there are basically 6 countries that have active chemical weapons programs. The list includes Egypt, Israel, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Libya. 4 of these countries are believed to have used chemical weapons, including Iraq, Iran, Libya, and Egypt. The first 3 of those countries used chemical agents in the last few years. Now, the Egyptians were the first country in the Middle East to acquire militarily useful stocks of chemical agent. During the 1960s, they appear to have had 2 what are called first-generation agents, ones that were used in the First World War, mustard gas and phosgene, and there's at least a possibility they may have had nerve gas as well. Certainly by the early 70s, they had a fairly well-advanced program, including nerve agents, and they've continued to work on their program since then. For those who followed the news, they're aware that in the last couple of years, the Egyptians have bought a complete factory to make nerve agent plus the precursor chemicals required to produce the nerve agent. Now, as I mentioned, the Egyptians did use chemical agents in North Yemen between 1963 and 1967. However, it's significant that they did not use their chemical capabilities subsequent to that, certainly not in any of the wars that they fought against Israel. Now, the Israelis appear to have acquired their stocks of chemical agents in response to the Egyptian use of such weapons. Their program was clearly well in place by 1973, when they are known to have had an offensive chemical attack capability. Now, currently it's believed that they have a reasonably sophisticated chemical weapons program that includes production of nerve agents. Israel has never used chemical weapons, and in contrast to statements that have been made by Israeli officials about nuclear weapons, they have never publicly referred to a chemical weapons program. The Iraqis initiated their efforts to acquire chemical agent production facilities in the early to mid-1970s. By the early 80s, with the assistance of companies from the industrialized world, and especially from West Germany, they built facilities able to produce up to about 1,000 tons of chemical agent a year. Now, the United States was able to interfere to some extent with the Iraqi production effort, primarily by blocking supplies of the chemicals necessary to produce chemical agents, but the success was only limited. Since that time, in the last few years, the Iraqis have been able to substantially expand their chemical production capabilities, and in his testimony before Congress, Judge Webster noted that even though the Libya chemical plant was the largest single chemical weapons facility in the Middle East, the total production in Iraq was greater. In addition to expanding their production capability, the Iraqis have also put a lot of effort into expanding their ability to produce the chemicals needed to produce chemical agents, the precursor chemicals. And it looks as though by the early 1990s, Iraq will be pretty much independent of foreign sources of precursors, which will essentially give them an independent production base. Now, Iraq employed chemical gas against the Iranians and Kurds extensively during the recent hostilities. These attacks culminated in a series of vicious attacks against targets inhabited mainly by Kurdish civilians. Iranian and Kurdish figures suggest that as many as 50,000 people were killed or wounded by Iraqi chemical attacks. Although these figures may be exaggerated, it is quite clear that a tremendous amount of destruction was wrought by these weapons. Now, not a great deal is known about what the Syrians are up to. By the mid-1980s, it was known that they were producing chemical agents, including nerve gas, and that they had chemically armed warheads for their Scud missiles. At the present time, it's thought that they may have several dozen such warheads. Now, some experts have suggested that Syria may have the most advanced program in the region. Whether that's true or not is not clear, mainly because of the paucity of information, but it is evident that they have devoted a lot of effort to it. Now, as with the Iraqi case, it's believed that the Syrian chemical weapons program was made possible by the assistance of West German companies, as well as others. The only identified supporter has been West German. It's believed that others may be involved as well. The Syrians, however, even though they've had a chemical weapons capability since at least about 1972, have never used chemical agents so far as is known. The fourth country that has chemical agents and a chemical program in the area is Iran. Now, the Iranians may have had a small program prior to the start of the Gulf War in 1980, but it's fairly clear that the main impetus for their program was the war with Iraq. The first substantial stocks of chemical agents that the Iranians acquired probably came from unexpended ammunition that the Iraqis had dropped on the Iranians. However, subsequent to that, they are known to have worked to produce the agents themselves. How far along they are in this process is not clear, but it is known, for example, that they obtained chemical precursors from a lot of Western countries, including from the United States. Now, again, information is scanty, but it's generally believed that the Iranians used chemical agents on a number of occasions against the Iraqis. The last country that has a chemical weapons capability in the region are, of course, the Libyans, which is the country that has received the most attention lately. Now, the Libyan effort is focused on this chemical weapons production plant at Rabta, which, according to Judge Webster, could make tens of tons of chemical agent a day, and which the New York Times suggested could make 10 to 40 tons a day. Now, as is well known, the facility was essentially built with assistance from West German and other companies from the industrialized world. It is not clear that the plant is operational at this point in time. While it appears that they may have produced some chemical agent last year, I think the best estimate is at the moment that the plant is not operational and that it very well may not be brought online at any time soon. The Libyans are believed to have used chemical agents in the war against Chad, but if they did, it's pretty clear that they misused it and there were no casualties as a result of it. So that basically is the status of the chemical weapons programs in the region. Before moving on, however, I think it's worthwhile directing your attention to another part of the equation, which is the biological weapons proliferation. As far as I've been able to tell, every country that has a substantial chemical weapons program in the Middle East also has a biological weapons program of some kind. Which essentially means that most of the countries in the Third World that the U.S. believes is engaged in biological weapons development, in fact, reside in the Middle East. Now, a lot of attention is focused recently on the Iraqi program, and I think for good reason. The Iraqis not only appear to have been acquiring the wherewithal to build biological agents, but appear to have recognized that a biological weapons program is dependent on, in part, on the same kinds of capabilities that a pharmaceutical industry provides, and they have made substantial investments in that area in recent years. Unfortunately, the technical capabilities of these countries is growing, and I think we should expect to see them being involved in certain kinds of activities that would have been inconceivable even a few years ago. I don't think it will be surprising if at some time in the near future, at least some of these countries are able to exploit innovations in biotechnology. One thing that one has to pay some attention to for a variety of reasons is the delivery mechanisms that are used. And again, a lot of attention is focused on one particular kind of delivery mechanism, which are ballistic missiles. The reason that people have focused on ballistic missiles is that at the present they're the one kind of delivery system that a country can acquire that is pretty much insured of penetrating through any kind of defense. There are no defenses against ballistic missiles at the present time. Now, in addition, I think there's a general feeling that a lot of the ballistic missile programs in the Middle East have been directly associated with efforts to produce chemical weapons, and that a lot of these missiles are in fact intended to have chemical warheads at some point in time. Now, as I've already mentioned, the Syrians already are believed to possess chemical warheads for their ballistic missiles. It's also thought that Iraq and Iran are attempting to develop such warheads, though there's no indication as to how far along they are. The Iraqis may be intending to put their warheads on the two new missiles that they've developed, the Al-Hussein, which they used extensively against Iran last year, or their new Al-Abbas, which has an even longer range. Either of these missiles is capable of hitting a target essentially anywhere in the Middle East from Tel Aviv to Tehran. With the Al-Abbas, it will be even longer distances. The Libyans have also been reported to have a program to try to place chemical weapons on their missiles, and one would speculate that they're working in part with some of the other countries in the region, possibly the Syrians. In addition, I think there's a considerable concern that the Condor missile, which is being developed jointly by Argentina and Egypt with assistance from Iraq, as well as technology from Italy and Germany, is going to be fitted with a chemical warhead. The small size of the payload of the missile lends some credence to this particular possibility. Now, finally, one should note that in the Libyan context, the Libyans have lately been trying to acquire an extended range capability for some of their French and Soviet strike aircraft, and I think this issue became of concern because at the same time, of course, the Libyans were trying to put online their chemical weapons facility, and there was at least some concern that the idea was that this would give the Libyans finally an ability to strike directly against Israel. Now, before proceeding, I think it's worthwhile spending some time on an issue that often gets ignored, which is looking at the reasons why these countries are trying to acquire weapons of this type. Now, admittedly, what I'm going to say is sometimes rather speculative because the information is often rather scanty, but I think it's justified by the evidence available. One thing that is perfectly clear is that a lot of these countries have devoted considerable time and energy and resources in developing their chemical and biological programs, and it suggests that they have a strategic role in the country's political military strategies. I'm going to suggest 4 reasons why countries in the region have developed these particular capabilities. The first one is something that was already mentioned, which is sort of the generic rubric of the poor man's nuclear bomb. It's a number of countries in the Middle East, I'm inclined to think, see these weapons as a means of acquiring political and military status. At least one Iranian official, Hashemi Rafsanjani, actually referred to these weapons in this particular fashion as poor man's atomic bombs. They are an inexpensive means of acquiring a certain kind of military capability that has a considerable political military utility. It is very likely that the original acquisition of chemical agents in the 60s and 70s was activated by exactly such motivations. A large number of countries in the region have deep-seated concerns about national survival. Israel's obviously one, but there are others as well. And possession of these weapons seems an alternative path to security. Now, a second point that I'm not sure I'd rate second in importance, but I think has to be addressed, is the argument by certain Arab countries that they require chemical weapons as a deterrent against the Israeli nuclear capability. In Paris earlier this year, this argument was made quite consistently by a number of Arab diplomats ranging from Egypt to Iraq. And I think even though I have some serious reservations about the argument, I think from the point of view of Israel's neighbors, one cannot dismiss it out of hand. The reason I have reservations is that it is more than a bit disingenuous for the Iraqi Foreign Minister, Tariq Aziz, to advance such a claim. Certainly, the experience over the last 8 years does not provide a very compelling case to suggest that the primary motivation for Iraqi possession of chemical agents is because they're worried about Israel. I suspect the Kurds and Iranians would find such an argument a bit specious. More significantly, the manner in which the Iraqis have used the weapon does not provide much evidence to suggest that they see it as a deterrent as opposed to something that has military utility. If it was only a deterrent, one suspects they would not have used it so willingly against the Kurds recently. And it's something that creates problems for other countries in the region, especially Israel, because deterrence depends on rules of the game, and it's not clear what rules of the game the Iraqis are playing by. Having said that, I'll proceed to a third and fourth point. At least some of the countries, I think, have their chemical weapons as a deterrent against chemical threats. Especially in the Middle East, where the climate mitigates against reliance primarily on defensive measures, it is necessary to have a kind of capability that would force your opponent to adopt similar defensive measures. In hot climates, it's very difficult to rely on protective suits. The temperatures are so high, and the suits tend to basically retain heat, and as a result, you cannot wear them for extended periods of time. Therefore, it's necessary to force your opponent to suit up if you have to do likewise. Now, at least in their public statements, the Iranians have explicitly made such linkages, whether you believe them or not, but I tend to believe them. And I suspect that at the present time, this is a primary element of the Israeli motivation for chemical weapons. Finally, and perhaps most disturbing, I think it's fairly clear that a number of countries view chemical weapons as a very useful means of suppressing internal revolt. It is evident that a number of countries have used these weapons in this way. The Iraqis most recently. It's essentially what the Egyptians were doing in the 1960s. And my suspicion is that this model has not gone unnoticed. Having said that, how does the proliferation of chemical weapons affect the Arab-Israeli military balance? Now, I think the Israelis have justifiable reasons for being concerned about the proliferation of chemical and biological weapons in the Arab world, particularly about ballistic missiles. Israeli air defenses are very good and can probably keep out aircraft strikes. There is very little that they could do about ballistic missile attacks, and there's essentially nothing they could directly do about an Iraqi ballistic missile attack launched from Iraq. It would take only about 8 minutes for an Iraqi ballistic missile to fly that whole distance. So that there is a real reason for Israel to be concerned. Having said that, even though Israel may be the intended target of many of the Arab chemical weapons programs, the Israelis are better able to cope with the threat than any other country in the region, and actually than most countries around the world. Because of Israel's high sensitivity to casualties and because of the symbolism of poison gas being used to kill Jews, Israel has taken a number of steps needed to minimize its vulnerability from chemical weapons. It has acquired chemical defenses for its soldiers and civilians. It possesses a chemical retaliatory capability and has articulated a retaliatory policy against those who use chemicals against it. Thus, while Israel is justified to be concerned about chemical threats, my own feeling is that it is capable of dealing with such a challenge. As a result of the Israeli initiatives, it's highly unlikely that any Arab state, with the possible exception of Libya, would use chemical weapons against Israel. Certainly there is good reason to doubt that the Syrians would make use of chemical weapons under current circumstances. The Syrians recognize that they do not have the ability to defeat Israel militarily, and as a result have not achieved what they call strategic parity. Under those circumstances, any war between Syria and Israel, for example, is likely to be a limited one from a Syrian point of view. Using chemical weapons would not limit a war. It would in fact escalate it, something the Israelis have made very clear to the Syrians. In contrast, by not using chemical weapons, the Syrians can constrain Israeli actions, reducing the willingness of Israel's leadership to undertake certain kinds of military operations. For example, the Israelis would have to think carefully before launching a bombing campaign against high-value economic targets, as was done during the 1973 war. As a result of these considerations and others, as I said, I don't think that any Arab country, again with the possible exception of Libya, would use chemical weapons against Israel. The Israeli ability to retaliate is well known. Now, as I've suggested, the proliferation of chemical and biological weapons is continuing. Despite the ceasefire between Iraq and Iran, both countries are continuing their programs. Indeed, in some respects, it appears that they're taking advantage of the ceasefire to accelerate certain kinds of activities related to their chemical and biological programs. Unfortunately, the ability of the U.S. to influence what's going on in the region, I think, is diminishing. As I noted earlier, a number of countries have developed a considerable infrastructure to make both chemical agents and precursor chemicals, which will make it harder for the U.S. to intervene in ways to prevent production of these weapons. On that somewhat pessimistic note, I'll close my remarks and we can proceed from there.
Thank you very much, Seth. We're now going to go back to the beginning of the program. And we will have an opportunity later. Seth will be part of the panel, and you'll have an opportunity to question him and the other panelists. At this time, I would like to introduce Gary Thatcher. Gary Thatcher has been a diplomatic correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor in Washington since 1986. Reporting on American foreign policy issues with special emphasis on East-West relations. Last year, Mr. Thatcher did a major series on chemical and biological warfare for his paper, which has been reprinted in tabloid form. He has served as Moscow correspondent for the Monitor, as a reporter for CBS News, and the national editor of the Monitor in Boston. He has also been the Monitor South African correspondent and its correspondent for Southern United States. Mr. Thatcher began his journalism career as a reporter for WDAM television in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and WAPI television in Birmingham, Alabama. As the opening speaker for this symposium, Mr. Thatcher intends to outline the history of this issue and where the technologies may be headed and what many of us believe may be a future. Will you welcome Mr. Gary Thatcher?
Will you please accept my apologies for being late? We had a secretary somewhere who obviously came under the influence of some sort of biological agent and got the times wrong. I suspect that we'd find it was a hallucinogen, but in these days you really can't tell what is happening. What I'm going to do for you first is sort of walk through a little of the research that we went through to do this series of articles that we published last year. And from that, you'll understand why I've been asked to speak about the particular topic, which is the new emerging technologies that could pose a threat. When I was first given this assignment, it was going to be strictly a review of chemical weapons. Well, I thought it was pretty cut and dried. Chemical weapons aren't fully under control. In 1972, we signed a biological weapons convention, which I thought in my ignorance had basically taken care of that problem. And I thought, you know, the two are essentially separate. Never the twain shall meet. For purposes of this discussion, just to review, and I know many of you already know this, but for those who don't, let's just go over it again. The distinction traditionally has been that biological weapons or biological agents have the ability to reproduce themselves, and chemical agents don't. And that has been the key definition throughout this whole debate. What I found as I started my research is that this line is blurring, that there's a gray area emerging between the traditional chemical agents and the biological agents. First, I'm going to tell you how I found out about that. In the course of the research, and this took the better part of a year and involved hundreds of interviews, some of the interview subjects are in this very room and can probably call me up short if I get this wrong, but in the course of the interviews, we discussed a number of things, and then people kept talking about this business of novel agents. Novel agents, to me, as a journalist, obviously meant someone who helps you get book contracts. I was completely unaware when I started with the research about this whole developing area of this gray area. In particular, I had a discussion with a U.S. intelligence analyst who talked about the possibility of cloning snake venom. I thought, well, this is you know, bizarre stuff, and it is. But he said, really, when you think about it, intelligence agencies across the world have traditionally relied upon things like venoms for assassinations. If you could produce significant amounts of, say, rattlesnake venom, why wouldn't that be an effective battlefield weapon? Why couldn't you take a cluster bomb and coat the flechettes inside with venoms, which when they hit someone would turn a very tiny nick into a ultimately fatal wound. And, of course, the traditional reason has been because it would be an enormously difficult task to collect the venom that would be needed for even one bomb. As one intelligence analyst put it, it would have a pretty obvious satellite signature if you had Red Army recruits scouring the deserts of Central Asia milking rattlesnakes. However, 1972, the very year that the Biological Weapons Convention was enacted, researchers in California for the first time cloned recombinant DNA and created, or at least laid the foundation for creating virtually endless amounts of a biological agent, so long as you could get a minuscule amount for the beginning of the process. And this opened up this entire area of novel agents, of biologic agents that could be reproduced in a laboratory, whereas they couldn't have been collected from nature. Well, I took this bit of information and started asking around at various institutions and found that, in fact, it was a primary concern, if not a preoccupation, with a number of American policymakers, the issue of so-called novel agents. I found that, in fact, the Pentagon had seriously considered the possibility of mixing agents in what I called a deadly cocktail of venoms or other poisons. As an example, what if on a battlefield soldiers started coming down with something which resembled rabbit fever, which is a classic biological agent? And the standard procedures were to treat it with a vaccine, and that was done. And then, in fact, the symptoms suddenly started changing to something that more closely resembled a snake bite. Worse still would be the possibility that the treatment that was administered to take care of the first set of symptoms, that is, say, rabbit fever, would in fact trigger the onset of the second set of symptoms, that is, the poisoning by venom. And you'd end up with a sort of deadly guessing game of trying to figure out really what it was that was infecting your soldiers and what you should do to try and cope with the problem. And as you can see, the possibilities on a battlefield are virtually limitless. It would be a frightening possibility if this sort of thing ever got out. So then you have to find out exactly what people are talking about, and you go to various experts and find that, in fact, they're talking about many, many different things. Some people in the biological defense research area are talking about better, more effective ways of producing the known biologic agents and distributing them in biological weapons. Other people are talking about mixing biological and chemical agents in the same payload. Others are talking about even more exotic technologies. If I have contributed anything to this debate, I think I have contributed the very small task of trying to come up with a definition of a novel agent. And so, in fact, I've given examples of the kinds of things we're talking about as we talk about novel agents. First of all, we're talking about well-known biological agents such as anthrax, which could be produced by new methods such as genetic engineering. We're talking about toxins which were previously so difficult to collect that they were discounted as a warfare agent, but now through recombinant DNA research could be used. We're talking about mixtures of poisons, including compounds that could be potentially more lethal, virulent, difficult to treat. We're talking about substances that occur naturally in the human body, but that in enormous quantities can have an unpredictable effect, such as the bioregulators, human growth hormones, things like that. We're talking about so-called low molecular weight agents. These are agents that have such a tiny, tiny molecular weight that theoretically one molecule could slip right through the activated charcoal filters of a mask or a protective suit. Air molecules already do this. The question is, could you produce a toxin, a venom of something that could do the same thing? And then we're talking about genetically altered microorganisms, things that start out as one particular kind of biologic agent and then through a very tiny change in the protein structure either become resistant to treatment through traditional kinds of medical vaccines or whatever, or basically become more virulent, possibly more infective. It's difficult to say, but basically we're talking about a fairly broad category of things here. The figures were rather startling, and I'll pull them out for you. I didn't believe these figures myself, and I ran them through 3 or 4 different experts, all of whom told me that it's absolutely true. But if you start out with a tiny, tiny portion of a biologic agent and put it in the old cooker and start using recombinant DNA technology, you can end up with an enormous amount of molecules. The exact figures, I believe, are here, but I'll go from memory and probably get it wrong. I believe that if you start out with one cell that reproduces itself every 30 minutes and leave it for 24 hours, you end up with something like 21 billion cells. And I know that doesn't sound mathematically possible, but it really is. And these things reproduce themselves very, very quickly. I should tell you before we go further that there is a great deal of controversy over whether these things even exist at all, whether they could theoretically exist even. Some people, like Matthew Messelson at Harvard, who's probably one of the best private sector experts on this field, dismiss them out of hand and say, listen, this is pure fantasy. This is the kind of thing that people in the Pentagon come up with to give themselves bigger budgets. It's simply not going to happen. Others tell me that that really is not the case. In fact, I was in Moscow at one of the Soviet research institutes and heard a Soviet diplomat who's now negotiating the Chemical Weapons Convention tell me that his scientists have concluded we basically have 5 years before there's a breakout. And somebody comes up with one of these novel agents that in effect renders our protective gear useless, makes our vaccines useless, and that there's a fairly narrow window of opportunity which we've got to exploit to try and bring these under control as we bring chemical weapons under control. There's some evidence that American and Soviet policymakers have recognized the dangers and are coming to grips with it. It's one of those little-known things that could easily be missed, but if you look at the list of chemical weapons that are going to be brought under control at Geneva under the ongoing Chemical Weapons Convention, you'll find that there is one toxin in there, a shellfish toxin, saxitoxin. And immediately you say, well, no, wait a minute, this is a Chemical Weapons Convention, so why are we putting a biologic toxin in there? And the answer is very simple, because then you've gotten double coverage for chemical, biological weapons, and anything else that might come under the general heading of toxins. Basically, what we're talking about is expanding the notion of inspecting U.S. chemical and pharmaceutical plants and worldwide chemical pharmaceutical plants to also inspecting biologic research facilities, laboratories, any place that can do recombinant DNA technology, because basically that's the only way to make sure that you don't simply bring the chemicals under control and have someone else, often some laboratory and who knows where, coming up with a new agent that in effect makes all this obsolete. One particular intelligence agent that I talked to said that his concern was that we are going to get a chemical weapons convention, that it's going to be have a fairly intrusive set of verification procedures, and that everyone's going to be, not everyone, but most people are going to be fairly forthcoming in allowing inspection of their chemical weapons facilities. And the reason is that it's not really going to matter to them or to those who really want to do damage to people, because the real danger is going to come from these novel agents, which can be produced in non-traditional settings, non-military settings, out-of-the-way places, and that all of the work that we've done up to now in the way of protection could be rendered obsolete. That is probably a fairly alarmist view. On the other hand, I think we have to take into account that these possibilities exist. What are we doing about it? The United States has an extensive chemical and biological weapons protection program, doing all sorts of research at a number of private sector facilities in this country. What are the Soviets doing? That's another question entirely. Glasnost, unfortunately, has not penetrated very far into the Soviet structure, and that is the other superpower that has the capability of producing biologic agents, we believe, and perhaps doing the research to combine chemical and biologic into a novel agent. And the Soviets really aren't very forthcoming on that. I was one of the very few Westerners to ever get into one of their biological research institutes. And I asked, in particular, the head of the institute, who happened to be working that day on a hepatitis B vaccine, what about this area of novel agents? Are you doing any work that can conceivably be offensive in nature? And his answer was not very encouraging. He said, well, I can tell you that certainly this institute we're not doing it. And he said certainly in the Academy of Sciences we're not doing it, because that's where the most prestigious people in the country work, and Obviously, if they were doing it, I'd know about it. And he said, therefore, it's logical to assume that nobody's doing it, because after all, if we were going to be doing it, we'd have our best scientists. And I thought, really, that's a pretty poor guarantee, because a guy says that he knows that they're not doing it in one institute, that therefore it's logical to assume nobody's doing it. The Soviets have not been very helpful in terms of allowing open inspections of their biological facilities. The United States has been far more open in terms of publishing what it's doing in its own biological research facilities. The Soviets have virtually published nothing. So if you look for glasnost or openness on that particular subject, so far there's very little. The United States program is a model of openness in comparison. We have no doubt exactly what's going on at Fort Detrick, which is our primary biological defense research institute. There are some doubts as to what may be going on in some of the other institutes. But if you look at the public information that's come up about the kinds of novel agents that we're searching for antidotes to, or the kinds of weapons that the Pentagon is studying as a possible threat, then you do begin to get squeamish. You're talking about diseases that haven't appeared on this continent in centuries, climate, that are carefully cultured in places like the most humid parts of Africa. You're talking about things that I can't even pronounce the names of, things that are really very frightening to laymen who don't understand the methods of transmission in the first place and don't understand why, what was formerly an area that seemed inconceivable is suddenly a threat. I must admit that as I was researching this material, I had some doubts, some skepticisms about, well, really, biologic stuff and novel agents and things like that. What turned me around was a trip I took to Scotland last spring. Off the coast of Scotland is a place called Grunard Island. Grunard Island was chosen by the British Ministry of Defense in the 1940s to do some biological weapons testing. The British were concerned that the Axis powers had some biological agents. The Germans, rather, had some biological agents, and they were going to be doing some testing or some possible use in populated areas. And so the British decided they needed to strike first. So they carefully cultured anthrax spores, put them in canisters, and tethered some sheep to stakes on Grunard Island, and started exploding these canisters of anthrax around them, basically trying to determine how long it would take before the sheep were infected and how long it would take before they died. Well, the record indicates that this was a pretty harum-scarum approach, blowing the things up and hoping that nothing happened. But Grunard Island is 3 miles off the coast of Scotland. It's in a little inlet, and they assumed that the prevailing winds would not carry it those 3 miles over to the mainland, or that if spores from anthrax did somehow get airborne, they would fall into the water, which is, of course, salt water, and they would be killed. And they assumed that if you kept the island isolated, no big problem. I went there in 1988, which was 40 some odd years after the testing. And that year, and in fact that month, the British government declared anthrax no longer a threat on Grunard Island and declared that it was safe for human habitation and for use. I interviewed the sheep farmer I actually interviewed the wife of the sheep farmer. He wouldn't talk to the press. The wife of the sheep farmer who had put a flock of sheep to graze on that island. What had happened was, back in the 40s, somehow anthrax did get off Grunard Island, and there was a major outbreak on the Scottish mainland. Thousands of sheep were killed. The British government quietly paid compensation, shut off the island, and for 40 years it was a no man's land. Nobody could go on it. The place was contaminated. It took them that long to figure out the extent of contamination and the methods of decontamination. And finally, 40 years later, they got a man named Angus Rinnock to put sheep on the island and determine whether or not it would be safe to resume agricultural activities on the island. And Mr. Rinnock's wife told me that they had put a lot of sheep there, and veterinarians had come and checked, and there was no big problem, and the sheep were fine and healthy, so it seemed like it was perfectly safe. So I thought, well, there's a good story for you. Then the more I started checking, about sort of little minor points, I found out that Mr. Rennick and his son had gone over to this island with a boatload full of sheep under the careful supervision of some researchers from the British government. Mr. Rennick was wearing his boots, his wool sweaters in that spring day, but the British government researchers were wearing biological protection suits that covered them from head to toe, and also wearing white boots, rubber boots, so that just in case anything happened, they wouldn't be infected. And I thought, that's a brave man to go over there and put those sheep on while all the scientists are running around in their protective gear. And I thought that was a brilliant metaphor for what we're really facing here. The possibility that some other experiment goes wrong, that somebody finds a new sort of lethal substance which could infect an entire area. Would we be so brave as to do what Angus Rennick did and say, even 40 years later, it's okay to go back? Or would we be a little more like those guys in the white suits who determined that they weren't willing to take the chance, let somebody else take it? Well, that is exactly the kind of thing, it seems to me, that it's in the interest of our policymakers to avoid. And if the Soviets are right, and it's 5 years down the road before this window of opportunity closes, and someone comes up with these sorts of agents that could be fielded on a massive scale, then we all have something very serious to worry about. Those are my comments. I'm glad to take any questions. I hope you'll understand why, even though with the delay, we determined that this was not a topic we wanted to discuss right before you went to lunch. But I'm happy to discuss anything you'd like about this research that we undertook or what we found out in the course of it. Thank you. You can get him.
Are there any questions for Mr. Thatcher? Just as a reminder for procedure, if you wish to ask any questions, you'll note that there are 2 microphones on each side of the room. We would appreciate if you would use those microphones in the aisles to ask your questions, 1, so that everybody could hear, and 2, so that your questions can be recorded on C-SPAN, so that we can preserve all the questions and all the answers. Are there any questions at all for Mr. Thatcher at this time? Yes, sir. Could you go to the... I think you're going to have to do that if you're going to follow my instructions. This gentleman's going to...
I'm Sam Morgenstein, United Jewish Appeal Federation, Greater Washington. Is there any evidence that there is any relationship in development of these products between the Soviet Union and the countries in the Middle East?
Not that I'm aware of. There's a lot of suspicions, but as far as I know, no hard evidence. There are other people in this room who probably could contradict me on that one way or the other, but as far as I know, no hard evidence. One of the interesting things about the chemical business in particular is, according to at least some intelligence analysts that I've talked to, is that the Soviets' hands are pretty clean in the Middle East in particular. That the Soviets don't seem to have a particular interest in seeing that situation get out of control in the Middle East. As you know, there's an ongoing controversy about what the Soviets did in Southeast Asia with Yellow Rain, but it seems that the Soviets have been somewhat reluctant to get involved as heavily in the Middle East, and I would assume that the same would hold true with biological agents. The Soviets do seem to be acting in good faith in Geneva to try and negotiate a protocol that would allow a fairly extensive, in fact, even more extensive inspection than the United States proposal. It's interesting. I was at the State Committee on Science and Technology in Moscow and pointed out that under the Soviet proposal that's on the table now in Geneva for both chemical and biological weapons, or biological agents we're talking about, challenge inspections anytime, anywhere, without any right of refusal, anywhere on the territory of the Soviet Union or the United States or any other signatory party. It's an extraordinary provision in that agreement. The United States doesn't think it's ever going to fly, but the Soviets say that they have run this past their own organs, including the KGB, and are perfectly comfortable with that proceeding. The United States is not perfectly comfortable with the proceeding, and you can assume that what will emerge out of Geneva will be something less than the United States' own proposal of any time, anywhere. But the Soviets, to my mind, don't want to see this stuff get out of control any more than we do. Because I see a Soviet colleague here in the audience, I'll just express this hopeful note. The Soviets have been very, very serious about the quality of negotiators they put forward at Geneva. One particular person, Nikita Smidovich, who's head of their, or one of their diplomats in their department of, I think it's called Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and Nuclear Energy. They're not real big on finding snappy acronyms in the Soviet Union. Speaks fluent English, smattering of German, gets along in French, I believe, obviously Russian, knows this topic inside and out. As someone told me, if you put him in a room down with the United States negotiators and cut out all of the middlemen, you'd probably end up with a pretty strong treaty. They're putting very high caliber diplomats onto the topic, and they're working very hard, I think, to come up with a provision. So personally, I don't think it makes sense for them to be working on the kinds of extensive verification procedures that they seem to be working on if on the side they're helping this technology be dispersed further. I think they see it as just as unpredictable and just as dangerous as we do. Having said that, they're also very, very reluctant to allow inspections in their own facilities, and that's where they need to improve.
Any other questions? I would be delighted to turn up the volume if I knew how to turn up the volume. It's difficult for I'm sure there are many technical people. We can't turn up the volume? I can only ask then that the speakers speak a little more loudly, and then hopefully everybody will be able to hear. Are you able to hear me at this moment? All right, fine. Going back now to our position on the agenda and to our panel, and the second participant in our panel, the Middle East, the beast is loose. Neil C. Livingstone is the president of the Institute on Terrorism and the Subnational Conflict. Mr. Livingstone has written 7 books and more than 60 articles, including Inside the PLO. He has served on advisory panels to top government officials, including the Secretary of State and the Chief of Naval Operations, and has testified before the Vice President's Task Force for Combating Terrorism. He is an adjunct professor on national security studies at Georgetown University, is the consulting editor of Livingston Books' Low Intensity Conflict series, is a consultant on security and crisis management and business and industry, is the president of the Institute on Terrorism and Subnational Conflict, and is a former consultant to ABC News 2020 and to the CBS's The Equalizer. Will you please welcome Mr. Livingstone?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm delighted to see such a fine organization take such a serious interest in a problem that when Joe Douglas and I got involved in it initially about 8-9 years ago, it really was very hard to get an audience, get anyone interested. This was input overload for most people in government policy at that time. It was one more problem that they didn't have answers to and they really didn't want to think about. Recently, I got this letter in the mail, and it was a night that I had been invited out to celebrate the Marine Corps' birthday last November, and I got home late, and I didn't vet my mail as carefully as I normally do, thanks to the hospitality down at Quantico. When I opened it up, I found that, and I should have looked at the postmark more carefully, I don't get that many letters in pencil from San Quentin. And it turned out to be from a fellow named Kabegovic. And Mr. Kabegovic has been there since 1973, when he was arrested by federal authorities having almost completed a nerve agent with which he was going to come to Washington, D.C. to kill the President of the United States. He was apprehended after one of the greatest manhunts in the history of the United States, and they found out that Mr. Kabegovic was the so-called alphabet bomber of Los Angeles. What Mr. Kabegovic had done, in addition to mailing toxic material through the mail to the President of the, to a member of the Supreme Court, as well as to one other top federal official, was he had sent a tape to Washington saying, "I'm coming to Washington and I'm going to kill the President, and this is how I'm going to do it." Now, Mr. Kabegovic described the nerve agent that he was working on, and the federal authorities took him very seriously because he had all the right terminology and he sounded knowledgeable. Now, in analyzing the tape and using some extraordinary enhancement techniques, they were able to narrow down the universe of people that they were looking for. And the first thing they decided was Mr. Kabegovic probably had been born in another country, probably in Yugoslavia, was probably a naturalized American citizen. Secondly, he probably got his chemical weapons training in the U.S. military, in the U.S. Chemical Corps, because of the terminology he used. And as we all know, the Army teaches you one way to do something, and one way only. And he was knowledgeable, but he had a certain precise way of explaining what it was he had. Thirdly, using these extraordinary enhancement techniques, they were able to determine that he was located near an airport and in a certain direction in terms of the flight pattern. The airliners going over were inaudible to the naked ear on the tape. But that, given also the fact that the tape had been postmarked from Los Angeles, California, suggested that he was in the proximity of LAX, Los Angeles International. And finally, they decided he was gay, and don't ask me how they did that. When they caught Mr. Kabegovic, and they had narrowed down the universe of possible suspects to about 7 or 8 people, when they knocked at the door of Mr. Kabegovic's house and they found out that he was the culprit, he was only one ingredient away from having a perfected nerve agent. And he had made arrangements to pick that up later on in the day from a chemical supply warehouse in the Los Angeles area. Now, I have the good fortune to be his pen pal on a variety of topics today, but I think the significant thing about this is that Mr. Kabegovic did this in 1973. When Joe and I started writing about this, people looked at us as though this were science fiction. Even some of our colleagues suggested that we were fear-mongering and engaged in science fiction. Yet the fact of the matter was that more than 15 years ago here in the United States, we had a lone individual who was prepared to come to Washington with a nerve agent and use it against top federal officials. Now, since that time, we've had many other incidents where we have what are called non-state actors, that is, single individuals, small groups of people, not governments and terrorists, criminals, crazies, who are engaged in efforts to develop chemical and biological agents and to use them. Joe and I wrote something called The Poor Man's Atomic Bomb, and we described a number of scenarios. And it's no coincidence that the first scenario, which was a fictional scenario to show how such agents could be applied, was targeted at a West Bank settlement in Israel. And it was one of 5 or 6 scenarios in our original monograph, and we expanded that to 10 or 11 later on. And we postulated an attack against the settlement upwind using a very rudimentary generator, using a very rudimentary agent by someone who, in this case, more than likely Palestinian terrorists, intent on driving the Israelis out of the West Bank area. Therefore, the Middle East, the beast is loose, which is ostensibly the topic of our discussion here, is reality. It's practicable today. I just returned from Israel, and the one thing you see lots of in Israel today are respirators and evacuation plans in the event that Israel is hit by some type of chemical or biological attack. And we in the United States should also take heed. We've often said that the problem is that the technology is loose, and you've heard that already. And most of it's declassified. I would imagine that someone with an advanced degree, preferably a master's degree, but a gifted undergraduate engaged in the study of microbiology or chemistry, could, in the privacy of their garage or their kitchen, whip up a weapon of mass destruction of a chemical or biological nature, capable of killing thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands of people, with no more degree of difficulty than brewing beer at home, and no more risk to themselves than refining heroin. This is the world that we live in. This is not science fiction, and this is the poor man's atomic bomb. One weapon will get you on the first team. It will give you parity in some cases with nation states. And today we live in a world of proliferation. By the end of the century, depending on whose figures you use, we'll have someplace between 25 and 50 countries which have chemical or biological capabilities. And some of those countries are going to have intermediate range warheads to marry the agents to, and others will have other types of delivery systems. Libya today, it should make you rest well, has Scud-B missiles. They could probably launch one from an old rusty freighter 150 miles off the U.S. coast, aim it at a U.S. city. And this, again, is a realistic scenario. It is not science fiction. We know that Libya today is soon to go into production in the largest chemical weapons production facility in the entire third world. And if you look at the list of countries which are engaged most assiduously in this arms race, we're not really talking about nature's noblemen in the list of international countries. We're talking about Libya and Ethiopia and Nigeria, talking about Egypt, Syria, Iraq, South Yemen, Argentina, on some lists, Peru, North Korea, Cuba. We're talking countries, many of which are engaged in the systematic support of international terrorism. And if you really want to carry out a terrorist action and not get blamed for it, the genius and the advantage of the kinds of weapons that we're talking about is that they can be delivered surreptitiously. They can be delivered by proxies. And you think we have problems with securing our airliners today from plastic explosives. Try securing some of our military bases, some of our embassies, some of our other critical installations to chemical or biological attack. And again, Joe and I and groups that we have been involved with have sat up long hours trying to postulate some of the vulnerabilities that we have today, and the list is very, very long. And if you look today at terrorist groups who, even without the sponsorship of states directly to develop such technologies, we're probably talking someplace in the neighborhood of a half dozen to a dozen terrorist groups which have flirted at least with the idea of developing chemical or biological agents, and some have actually tried to do so. A Red Army faction safe house in one of the Low Countries was knocked over a couple of years ago. Inside they found 200 kilos of organophosphorus compounds, probably going to be used in making some type of nerve agent. And again, we're talking about a terrorist group here. We're not talking about a country. I happened to notice in a broadcast statement by the PLO, which is dated January of this year, after the dialogue with the United States had already begun, Abu Tayyib, the number 2 man in the PLO's very vast structure of covert and deniable organizations, made a public statement. And I sometimes wonder, when I look at the statements that are made to us by Yasser Arafat and others, whether they don't think that we monitor their broadcasts, or that we don't look at the other statements that they make to their own community, or that they make to the third world, because they're 180 degrees different than the statements that they make to the West. Abu Tayyib said, "Our interest in chemical weapons is old. It is not something new." And he indicated that they were going to develop, in this case the PLO, weapons as a strategic first strike deterrent. We're talking about the PLO, and we're talking 2 months ago. We know that when the Israelis drove into Lebanon in 1982, that they found substantial material on chemical weapons training in some of the bunkers and so on that were overrun. Now again, I don't think that we have an immediate threat from the PLO using such weapons today, or any constituent element of the PLO. But unfortunately, this is the arms race that we are in today, and it's the one that I lose sleep over, because the technologies are there for everyone. That's why third world nations are developing them. We're talking about low-cost weapons, weapons that are reasonably easy to disperse. We're talking about weapons where the technology has filtered down to the lowest common denominator. Because after all you need to set yourself up in the development of nerve agents, for example, is basic pesticide technology. And pesticides work the same way, or nerve agents work the same way on human beings that pesticides work on insects. So as we look down the road at the Libyan chemical weapons production facility in Rabta, we look at all the warning signs out there today. We look at people who are already contemplating the poisoning of our food chain. We may have only had 2 grapes that were contaminated from Chile with cyanide, but we've had such attacks on a criminal basis for more than a decade, probably 2 decades. And interestingly enough, one of the most significant attacks was against Israel in the late 1970s, where Israeli citrus was contaminated. That is indeed a type of chemical warfare, though substantially more low-tech than some of the other vulnerabilities that we're looking at the present time. Therefore, I suggest to you that this is an urgent priority of the U.S. government today, and it must become one. We've had far too little public dialogue. In the past, we've had people who said we shouldn't have a public dialogue. All we'll do is frighten the public, and therefore we can push the problem under the table. We're going to have to think and contemplate the difficult kinds of solutions to this problem, and they get involved in all the nasty details of preemption, and preemption where we cannot provide completely to the American public all the sources and methods that may be involved in ascertaining the kinds of threats that we face from different enemies. We're going to have to look at violating the sovereignty of other nations. We're going to have to look seriously at taking out chemical weapons production facilities where those governments are involved in the direct support of terrorists, or where they may provide that technology to terrorist groups as a kind of proxy war against the United States and the West. One of the most frightening scenarios that we postulated was a rusty old Panamanian freighter with internal generators and external booms sailing up off the tip of Manhattan and releasing a biological agent or chemical agent, depending on ambient weather conditions and prevailing winds, to settle down over Manhattan. By the time we knew what hit us, that old freighter would be out in open waters again. We'd never know what the origin of the attack was, and we could have hundreds of thousands of people in New York City or any other large city in the United States already affected. And think of the panic and the chaos that would go with it. Again, we're talking problems today that are here and real and alive at the present time. And if we put off trying to find solutions, we're going to be in desperate straits when finally we are victimized directly. And with that introduction, I'll look forward to your questions later on.
Thank you, Mr. Livingstone. We'll now move right on to Dr. Joseph Douglas, who is a Washington-based national security affairs consultant with a quarter century of experience in defense policy and technology and intelligence. That experience includes service as the Deputy Director of the Tactical Technological Office of the Advanced Research Projects Agency and an association with the Institute of Defense Analyses, where he worked as a member of the Weapons Systems Evaluation Group. He has served on various Defense Science Board studies and is currently a consultant to the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Dr. Douglas has lectured extensively in the United States and Europe, is the author or co-author of numerous articles and books including America the Vulnerable, The Threat of Chemical and Biological Warfare. He is a graduate of Cornell University and has earned a BS, an MS, and a PhD in electrical engineering. He's also taught at Cornell University, at the Naval Postgraduate School, and Johns Hopkins School of International Relations. He serves on the editorial board of Strategic Review and on such advisory boards as the Institute of Foreign Policy Analysis and the American Security Council and the Institute on Terrorism and Subnational Conflict. Will you please welcome Dr. Joseph Douglas.
Thank you very much. I share Neil's recollection very strongly of starting to try and talk about this area many years ago and not finding very many receptive ears. And it is really a delight to see organizations such as B'nai Birith really trying to come to grips with this tremendously dangerous subject. Before looking at where we're headed, I think it's a good idea to take a few minutes and look at how we got to where we are, in particular to fix some of the responsibilities clearly in our mind. And what I would like to do is directly respond to the question, are the Soviets involved? In 1955 and 56, the Soviets set about to revise their Revolutionary War strategy to bring it into the context of the current age. One of the things they did at that time was to decide to put a great deal more effort into what they then decided to describe as wars of national liberation. This title was picked up particularly because it would distance the subject a little bit from Revolutionary War and provide a cover for their operations. One of the main activities they began as a result, or as part of this program, was the training of international terrorists. That began roughly, and decision was taken for that in 1955. And we have seen in the last 8 years a number of books now coming out and recognizing what is happening and identifying terrorist training facilities in the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Germany, and a number of other surrogate countries. We see the same thing happening in the chemical and biological warfare area. In 1964, the Soviets made a major decision that here was a tremendously powerful area that they needed to exploit. In particular, what heightened the need was their belief that nuclear war was really too dangerous. And they needed some alternatives to nuclear war, which they believed ultimately might come under control through some arms control agreements. This would be, or place the requirement on them, however, to develop alternative weapons that would be even more powerful and increase in their favor the balance of power. With this basic logic, they undertook a major development program in chemical and biological weapons. It had over a 20-year span, and the goal in terms of new weapons development was to introduce qualitatively new and different chemical and biological weapons by 1985. In 1965, they decided that this would be a major war in any NATO engagement, changed their operational plans accordingly, and also decided that it would be major weapons that would be used in third world areas and in particular in the Middle East. In 1967, Iraq approached the Soviet Union. They were concerned about nuclear weapons developments in Israel and asked the Soviet Union to provide them with nuclear weapons. The Soviets refused. Instead, however, they made a decision that fall to provide them with chemical and biological agents as a counter for Israel nuclear capability. And at that time, the source that had the direct information on this indicated that the main question remaining was how to provide the agents to Iraq, and indeed how to use a third agent, third country, or an intermediary party to distribute the agents to them so that they wouldn't be held immediately accountable. In the 1973 war, there were overtones of both chemical and biological capabilities, and of course when large quantities of equipment were seized, U.S. authorities were very surprised to learn the extent of the preparations that were implicit in this equipment for chemical and biological warfare. It was indeed this seizure of equipment that opened people's eyes quite a bit within the United States and caused a beginning of a movement away from a total neglect of the chemical warfare area that had begun in about 1970. In 1976 through 1981, we saw tremendous application of various types of chemical agents in Southeast Asia and Afghanistan that a number of people had a great deal of difficulty coming to grips with. Perhaps as much as anything else, I suspect that this application was one of the things that really got people going, got nations going, and spurred forward the proliferation of chemical and biological weapons that we see today. I found it very interesting to listen to the response of the Soviet academician to Gary that the Academy of Sciences would not be involved in any such activity. The Academy of Sciences is the major place where military R&D in the Soviet system is performed. It is performed under military security, particularly in the chemical and the biological area, very tight security. In thinking about these problems, we have to recognize also that it's not just the Soviet Union, but Eastern Europe as well. And that becomes especially important when you consider the capabilities in Eastern Europe for these different types of fields. For example, the head of the Czechoslovak biological warfare program back in the 60s was Professor Malik, who was a world-class microbiologist, very well-known individual. Now, where are we today and where are we headed? Everybody has mentioned the technological expansion, and this is a tremendous expansion that's in knowledge and that's taken place over the past 15 years, sort of a revolution in biotechnology that's increased our knowledge and ability to deal with all types of chemical and biological subjects. And we're just at the beginning of it. It'll go on and become worse every year. And one of the main attributes of this expansion is the proliferation of the abilities to work with agents between countries and to lower educational levels. As a couple of scientists had described it to me, what is done at the postdoctoral level 1 year is taught at the undergraduate level 2 years later. There are available almost an unlimited supply of options depending upon how crude you want to be or how sophisticated you want to be. There's a lot of stories about how difficult things are, and things can be very sophisticated and very difficult. On the other hand, one of the examples of how simple things can be was the marketing 2 years ago of a genetic engineering kit for kids, which involved all the necessary chemicals to actually remove genes from one organism and splice them into another organism. In an interview, the marketing scientist said it's impossible for any kid to screw up. The only way he could do that would be to drink the chemicals. So these things are available. It's just a question of one's interest in really taking advantage of them. And we certainly know in a number of terrorist organizations they are not devoid of technical talent and are known to have it. The applications are particularly interesting that come out in this area. Initially, people really had thought of chemicals mainly in battlefield application. I think that this is probably where 90% of the focus of our attention is placed at the present time. And certainly the new capabilities suggest the possibility of major developments in this area. What I find more interesting myself is that when you look at the technical capabilities that other applications now loom as far more important, strategic applications, political warfare, terrorism, covert sabotage, all these types of things really seem to key on the capabilities that are now available. We see, as many people have indicated, the expansion of chemical and biological interests. The weapons tend to be viewed as cheap weapons, as weapons that can be very effective as nuclear weapons if you want to view them as weapons of mass destruction. They can also be very selective. Many people are forced, in quotations, into trying to get this capability to have a deterrent because they see their neighbor about to do it, or they've looked at what happened in Afghanistan or Southeast Asia and decide, well, they should have this capability too. One of the things that really strikes me as of interest is, of course, the development of missiles within the Middle East, and where you have payloads where you want to say not go the whole technical route in the missiles so that you can just put nice conventional warheads on it to kill precise targets, but where you're a little bit less sophisticated. What is the obvious warhead? It's going to have to be one that takes advantage of inaccuracies in delivery system, and chemicals or biological is an obvious answer there. You don't get that for free, of course. There's a lot of work that has gone into and would have to go into the development of payloads, their testing, the dissemination mechanisms, and hopefully we would see that type of thing and have some advance warning. One of the very interesting aspects in this effect, of course, has been the cooperative efforts that have been developed over the past few years that we've seen, and I think Libya is an excellent example. There's two things that really struck me of interest to Libya that I'd like to share with you. Number one, while people have focused on these chemical plants, one of the things that has gone unnoticed were the reports on the joint efforts between Libya and Romania to develop biological weapons. This was reported by the former deputy head of Romanian intelligence several years ago. Another example that I find interesting, or a different way to look at this current problem with the chemical plants, is that in the past we've all recognized the opportunities, let's say, for conversion of a commercial plant for chemical warfare purposes, or for masking what you're doing under industrial ventures. The general example that's been used has been the manufacture of fertilizer, which also involve a lot of organophosphorus compounds. What struck me of interest was when the Libyans started to claim different directions of going, they talked about pharmaceutical plants. Now, if they're talking about masking the development of chemical weapons with a pharmaceutical plant, or a plant that looks like it's a pharmaceutical plant, one might wonder whether or not they're contemplating things that are more sophisticated than the mere application of nerve agents or the mere development of nerve agents. Terrorists, as Neil explained, are knowledgeable, and capable. They have looked at the possibility of the use of both biological and chemical agents. They have been found with the possession of the ingredients for making nerve agent. They have been found in the process of manufacturing toxins, botulinum toxin, for example, in Paris. The very well-known author who exposed international terrorism for the first time, Claire Sterling, indicated to me a couple years ago that she had identified discussions within the terrorist networks in Italy on the use of chemical and biological weapons. We have seen some sabotage take place. The best example that I can think of was the placement of nerve agents within the coffee of the Israeli officer mess, which happened a number of years ago, and I do not believe has ever been reported in the open media, to my knowledge. So it's there, but it hasn't really emerged. In trying to think of where this field is headed, there's sort of four questions that come to my mind. The first is sort of the obvious question: when will terrorists use chemical or biological weapons? Certainly so long as they can get the publicity, they can accomplish their ends with the use of tools that are familiar to them, there's no reason for them to take new risks. So the question really arises: when might they feel they had to make a statement of sufficient importance that they were really going to escalate it and go the route of chemical or biological agents? It's there, they know about it, but it really hasn't come out into the open yet. It hasn't hit us. One can devise numerous scenarios that would be tremendously effective. And this opens up a very large area for reasoned analysis in terms of what type of statement would they really want to make that would drive them to escalate into chemical and biological weapons. The second question in my mind is: how will people or governments respond to such an application? The example that Neil described about the alphabet bomber is a superb example of what I suspect is a very likely response, and that is tremendous cooperation among the various responsible government agencies. That particular episode was solved, as I recall, within 18 hours, if you can imagine that. And they bypassed all sorts of normal chains of command. But I think you'll see this type of cooperation, and the question is whether or not it comes too late, or whether or not the event might be avoided by some earlier attention. Are we really prepared? I think the answer to this is doubtful. And the last question is the issue being addressed? The clear answer 5 years ago, I think, would have been no. I think that what we see is individuals in different agencies identifying the problem, recognizing its considerable importance, and working to try and get funding and interest to do something about it. As an example, one can compare, say, what is done in the nuclear area, where there's a program that probably runs about $100 million a year called the Nuclear Emergency Search Team, that's focused on coping with a nuclear event should one arise. There is certainly no counterpart whatsoever, to my knowledge, in the chemical or the biological area, although the need has been identified for at least 5 years. Nobody wants to take it on, to my knowledge, or has the funding to do it. Although there have been motions in that direction in the last 2 or 3 years. There is interest building. I think that this type of a conference here is an excellent example of such interest, and one that's to be encouraged, because it's really the only way we're going to get this problem out on the table. I'm reminded of what I was told about 4 years ago in talking to the top people at the State Department on the problem of security in embassies, where we thought that there was a problem of potential chemical or biological warfare there that should be considered in the security programs. And indeed, there had been threats of the use of mustard against facilities in the European area. The response, however, that we got was very clear, and that was nobody's really concerned about this, and it won't change until there's been a major incident. Come back and see us then.
Thank you very much. We've now had the opportunity to hear from 3 panelists, and we'll give you a chance to ask some questions. I would first, though, want to just make one comment. Earlier this morning, a reference was made in the opening remarks about the use of chemical weapons in Afghanistan by the Soviets. We want to say for the record that this statement was based on press reports only. The United States government has made no such accusation, and indeed there has been no substantiation of chemical weapons use by the Soviets in that conflict. Now, I'm sure that there must be many questions for our panelists in regard to their 3 presentations. As I indicated, if you would like to ask questions, please come to the microphones, and then you'll be able to have an opportunity to identify yourself, and your question will also be recorded. While we're waiting for the first question, gentlemen, I would like to ask, just following up on the last speaker's statement, maybe the other 2 panelists could respond as to why they believe, since the technology is available and there are reasons and there are causes that terrorists wish to espouse, why there has not been the use of chemical and biological terrorist acts in the most recent past.
That's similar to the question that we often get on why is there not more terrorism in the United States. Part of it, as Joe said, is that the weapons are sufficient to the terrorists' purposes at the present time, the weapons that they have available. And there's been a tremendous escalation in the last decade of weapons available to terrorists. I'm reminded that the Irish Republican Army in the late 1970s held a press conference to show off an M60 machine gun that they had acquired presumably from lost American stocks in Southeast Asia, one of 2 such weapons, and they got a fair turnout to come and see their marvelous new low-tech machine gun. Today, there are probably a dozen terrorist groups that have surface-to-air missiles. You couldn't get anyone to come to look at a machine gun. In the space of a decade, we've gone to the vulnerability of civil aviation to surface-to-air missiles. We've actually lost a few planes, although they have all been in zones of conflict. Yet we have crossed 2 thresholds in the last 4 months. The first was the downing of Pan Am 103, which was a clear indication to the United States that terrorists were going to strike out directly at the United States, and they wanted a big body count. In the past, they haven't always sought a large body count. The second thing was the attack on the Rogers van 2 weeks ago in San Diego, which, if it turns out to be politically motivated, and I don't see any reason to suggest otherwise, it would be the first attack in memory on an American policymaker or an executor of policy in this country carried out by foreign terrorists or by sympathizers of foreign terrorists or a foreign government in the United States. We've had plenty of attacks of Palestinians against Israelis, Armenians against Turks, Iranians against Iranians, but we have never seen an American policymaker or executor of policy in this country directly singled out. So I think in terms of why haven't we seen an attack, partially we are just on the threshold of a whole new era of international terrorist attacks, and I think the handwriting is already on the wall. I believe also that we have preempted such attacks in the past because we have found the material, as Joe indicated, in safe houses in Paris at 41A Rue de Chalot, where the petri dishes were found upstairs in the bathtub where they were trying to harvest what in effect is botulism. And similarly, other safe houses knocked over with stockpiles of organophosphorus compounds. We have seen plenty of criminal activity. We see product tampering on almost a daily basis. We saw a threat in Cyprus a year ago to pollute the beaches with dioxin. We have had a number of criminal threats to use various types of chemical agents. They have been for criminal purposes, and I emphasize that, rather than political purposes to date. But I don't think our luck's going to hold out for much longer.
There's one thought I would add to that. The terrorists certainly are concerned about response. They're after a particular response. It may be that they also consider adverse responses. If you have an event that is of such a magnitude that it will actually change the way in which people begin to look at the problem, if it will be sufficiently great that it really starts to get the governments into taking actions, then that may be counterproductive to their interests. And I think that could also enter into their decisions, perhaps not to use it just yet, because if and when they do, there's going to be a tremendous eye-opening within the various governments, and it might actually lead to actions taken that are not to the terrorist interests.
Questions now. This gentleman.
Well, I want to make a comment and then have a question to Seth Karras. The comment, however, is to Dr. Douglas and Livingston. I happen to be a professional biochemist with graduate training. I worked and wrote on this subject between the mid-60s and the early 70s. I would disagree with virtually every one of their statements and with every one of their assessments. You cannot make these things in your garage or your kitchen. The chemical agents are very toxic, nerve agents. The biological agents, you work, and that's why we have such laboratories, Dietrich. You work under negative pressure. You work under extremely careful conditions. You need massive amounts of culture medium. The techniques for transferring your genetic material are not anything that anybody can do, and it's inconceivable that any child in the world, even a Westinghouse winner, could have a kit that could isolate and transfer genetic material. It's just preposterous. And my question is a very simple and short one of a different nature. Seth, given the U.S. Department of Defense understanding that Israel had chemical munitions by the early 70s, and you stated that Israel has stated a retaliatory policy and has the capability to carry out retaliation. I don't know if you meant that generically for all kinds of military actions or for chemical actions in particular. I'm puzzled then by the Israeli Deputy Foreign Minister's statement in January that Israel did not have chemical munitions.
What I was trying to say is basically the Israelis have never admitted to possessing chemical weapons. And in fact, they reiterated statements in January from a number of officials saying that they did not have chemical weapons. That view is, of course, not accepted here in Washington, and I think that the U.S. assessment is correct that the Israelis do have the capabilities. Now, the Israelis have not articulated a response based on chemical weapons. They've talked about things like, if chemical weapons are used against us, we will retaliate 100 times over. That, I suspect, is a veiled reference to a possible nuclear retaliation. In addition, there are, as I think has been discussed in other contexts, a lot of conventional retaliatory measures that one could take if necessary. Having said that, I think if you look at the Israeli program, it is likely that the reason they retain the chemical weapons they have in a circumstance where they also have a nuclear capability fits into this notion of, if we have to fight under chemical conditions, we make sure the other guy has to do the same thing. My guess is that, however, that if chemical weapons are used in a circumstance where there are civilian casualties, that the Israelis are not going to be content to counter-escalating to the same level, but that they are going to, in one form or another, escalate beyond that. And I think a recognition of that is one of the reasons why I am rather sanguine about the prospects of Syria not using chemical weapons in the future.
Mr. Livingston, Mr. Douglas, would you like to respond to the statement in regard to the ability of rather low-level educated people to be able to create these weapons?
It is shocking that a kit would be available, but it was offered for sale. And the developer came from, as I recall, MIT, gave several interviews in the media on it, and those were direct quotes that I used. There was another interesting case of two, I guess what we'll call them extortionists or potential extortionists, several years ago, who manufactured an ounce of ricin toxin, very potent toxin, and the people who apprehended him found out about it and took the vial up to some researchers at MIT again, and then found out about it, and they had to take it down in an armored car to, I believe, Dietrich, where it was analyzed and disposed of. About 4 years ago, I put together an effort for an agency of the government to really examine these types of questions, and in particular the nature of the various threats that really would exist. And we utilized several microbiologists, several biochemists, some MDs with experience in genetic engineering, and looked at the potential of what could be done, what capabilities were actually available, how much talent or techniques were required. The disturbing thing about most of these, the findings that came out, were completely in support of the types of things that Neil and I had talked about, and indeed we wrote our material after those studies had been taken place. The typical response of the people that I had recruited was, when I would go to them and first describe the nature of the problem, their first reaction for about 10 seconds was one of sort of abject horror. You know, what is this nut doing coming and talking to me like this? And then they'd sort of stop and think for a few minutes, and then they'd take a 180-degree different point of view, which is basically, you know, you're absolutely right, and the problem is much worse than what you make it out to be. Now, of course, things can be done under laboratory conditions, and they should be, and anybody conducting research with an ounce of common sense, I suspect, would want to take all the precautions. But we're not dealing with a perfect world, and all those facilities are not required, and one can do a great deal of mischief in his basement if he so desires.
Also, Gary is still here, so if there have any questions for him, I'm sure he would be happy to answer them. Yes, would you please identify yourself and speak as loudly as possible? Obviously, we have some problems with amplification.
Stefan Leader, Eagle Research. I just wanted to note, for the record, a fact that animal rights terrorists in the UK have, in fact, used noxious chemicals for political purposes in the last year alone. released acids whose fumes were designed to sicken employees of various facilities that they were trying to disrupt. These are not military chemical agents, but they are noxious chemicals used for political purposes, well documented.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, just
Would you please identify yourself
Sure.
and speak as loudly as possible?
Ofra Yeshua Live from Ma'ariv in Israel. I would like the last two speakers just to elaborate on two facts that they stated here I'm not familiar with. The one was the story about some poison administered into coffee of Israeli officers. I think Mr. Douglas said that was not published before. And the other, Mr. Livingston spoke about Mr. Tayeb talking about possible chemical use by Palestinians. Could you elaborate what sort of stuff they were thinking about?
This is really not a plug for a book, but I forget the date. The incident I described is in the book America the Vulnerable, and I believe the date at which it took place and the other particulars that we have are set forth there. I don't recall off the top of my head. I think rough, I would guess must be the last six to 8 years, but I don't recall for sure. In the coffee mess, yes. There's also an interesting example of a counterpart event that took place in the U.S. military during a nuclear alert exercise at which the coffee mess at a sensitive command post was loaded with LSD, and the entire command post was put out of action for about 2 hours. And it was basically put out of action then for the remainder of the exercise, and they didn't learn until 15 days later what had actually happened. There's no conclusion on that.
Please go to the...
I'm with the West German Press Agency.
Louder,
Can you hear me? I just wanted to ask you about these kits that can be bought on the market. Where can you buy them? What are they called? How much do they cost? Who produces them? Maybe I want one.
Maybe we'll sell some books for the first time in 2 years. That's also in the book, and matter of fact, I believe there's a copy of the advertisement that's in one of the illustrations. Well, there's some announcements on it out on the table. It's available from Lexington Books, and there's an 800 number you can call for that.
To respond to the rest of your question on the Abu Tayyab statement, it was an interview that was given in Jordan, and it was given to the Jordan Times. It was picked up by the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, and the text from Nicosia, Cyprus said Palestinian commandos have chemical weapons and will not hesitate to use them against Israel in future wars, a commando leader says, and it goes on from there. So, pardon me? No specifications in it. I thought it was an interesting threat to make, and quite frankly, I have a stack about this thick out of the FBIS reports picked up on the Baghdad Voice of PLO and various other Palestinian newspapers and media outlets, including Radio Monte Carlo, which, despite its characterization in the New York Times recently as an independent radio organization, in our new book we've very clearly demonstrated that it is majority ownership is in the hands of the PLO. So these kinds of statements are not infrequent, and I suggest to you that you attach your own efficacy to them.
Yes, sir.
I'm Eric Arnett from the National Security Program of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I have a question for Seth, but first I'd like to reiterate that the scientific community as a whole is very skeptical, at least the people I've talked to, of Livingston and Douglas's observations. For Seth, I'd like you to answer the first question that was posed, which is, are chemical weapons really any good for terrorism? I think you told a reporter for Newsweek a few months ago that since plastic explosives are some 10 times as lethal, it's really doubtful that they would ever be used for these applications. Could you comment further on that?
No, I'm not sure what I was quoted as saying. I have not spent a lot of time working on this subject. My own bottom line has been actually a point that was raised by both Drs. Livingston and Douglas, which is terrorists tend to use weapons that they are comfortable with and that they know how to handle safely. Up till now, the weapon of choice has clearly been some form of plastic explosive. And as a result of the virtues of that particular weapon and the ways in which you can use it, my inclination is to suspect that it will continue to be the weapon of choice. I'm not really inclined to go beyond that because I really don't know enough about the subject to make an intelligent comment.
Yes, please.
I'm Herbert Spielman. I'm attending this seminar in my capacity as the president of the National Capital Association, B'nai B'rith. I have a question really for Mr. Thatcher having to do with his comment concerning the Soviet position at Geneva. Did I understand him correctly to say that the Soviets had gone to considerable lengths to open their facilities to inspection on a random basis practically in connection with this business of chemical and biological weapons? We have known in the past that the Soviet Union has been very cautious in disseminating nuclear weapons to third world countries, for example, or nuclear capabilities to third world countries. And I wonder if, in that regard, there's a second question. Do we have good evidence that the Soviets have been willing to provide chemical and biological assistance to third world countries, particularly in the Middle East? I'd appreciate answers to both of those questions, please.
Thanks for the opportunity to clarify that point. What I was trying to get across is that the Soviets, in their negotiating position at Geneva, have come forward with some extremely intrusive verification procedures which would allow any country that signs on to the Chemical Weapons Convention that's being negotiated extremely extensive rights to explore what's going on in chemical weapons facilities, pharmaceutical factories, chemical production facilities, biological research facilities. But it's contingent upon getting other countries to agree to that Chemical Weapons Convention that's being negotiated. Short of that, up until that, the Soviets had been not forthcoming at all about allowing inspections. And that was the point I was trying to make with regard to the fact that glasnost has not permeated through to the actual inspection rights. Soviets have been through Fort Detrick. They've been through our chemical weapons destruction facilities at Tooele, Utah. They've been through various production facilities in the United States, fairly high-level people, including their Minister of Health. But they haven't, for the most part, reciprocated. They have allowed inspections at their facility at Shikani. They allowed representatives from, I think, 45 countries to visit there a couple of years ago. And they showed a bunch of 1940, 1950 vintage weaponry that no one really believes is a full accounting of their entire inventory. So they have not been at all forthcoming short of the convention. But they claim that once the convention is signed, they're going to be extremely forthcoming, if you see the distinction. As far as this area of sharing the technology in the Middle East, I have to stick with what I said earlier, which is that I don't have any evidence. And the evidence, to me, somewhat speaks to the contrary. I mean, if you look at where the production facilities are coming from in the countries that we know about, Iraq and Libya, they've managed to get it on the commercial market, primarily through West Germany, secondarily through Switzerland, through the Benelux countries. from the United States, for that matter. I mean, there's been more documented cases of feedstocks of raw materials coming from even the U.S. than there has been from the Soviet Union. So I guess what I'm saying is the evidence to me implies that they're getting it on the commercial market through false flags. If the Soviets were out there doing it, it seems to me like we would, first of all, have the evidence, and second of all, not have any doubts about the validity of making that evidence public.
Directly chemical weapons years ago. It's well documented.
Well, as I say, I don't have that evidence, and that's all I can go by. And I'm happy to take questions from people who have the evidence. But I certainly in Iraq, in Libya, the case maybe can be made in Syria that there's been more involvement. For instance, the Pikolov, the head of the Chemical Corps, visited Syria not too long ago, and I asked some U.S. intelligence experts about that and said, what do you make of this when the head of the Soviet Chemical Corps shows up in Syria? Isn't that a matter of major concern? And the theory was there that he was doing his own intelligence gathering, that they were as concerned as anyone else about what was going on there, and a nice way to take care of it was to send Pikolov on a visit and let him look the facilities over himself. But I stress to you, I know this is controversial, I know a lot of people would disagree, but that's the information I have, and I really can't go beyond what I've been able to uncover. Me or somebody else?
Well, Seth would like to make a comment. I just wanted to add a comment about what's known about Soviet involvement in the region. The Soviets probably did supply chemical agents in some quantity in the certainly in the 60s, maybe the early 70s. However, in terms of production capacity, I don't think there's anybody who believes that the Soviet Union has played a role in the current proliferation process. In fact, people are very adamant the other way around, that it is not the Soviets, and that there's no evidence of any kind of assistance. And in this regard, it's rather interesting, some comments that have come from Israeli sources about the Pikolov visit, is that in fact the final conclusion of the Israelis about that visit is that in fact it was not intended as a sign of support for the Syrian chemical program, as the Syrians implied publicly, but in fact was quite the reverse. It was an effort by the Soviets to tell the Syrians that they take very seriously the notion of a worldwide ban on chemical weapons, and that they have tremendous concerns about what the Syrians are up to. So my own feeling is that, however you think about the Soviets in this particular case, well, they did some things a long time ago that we don't like. Their record in the recent past has been very good.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Shayla Buckley.
Louder, please.
My name is Shayla Buckley. I work in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where I have responsibility for the chemical weapons treaty negotiations. And I just wanted to make a point of clarification. The intrusive inspection proposal described by Mr. Thatcher is an American proposal which was tabled in its entirety in 1984 by then Vice President Bush. It is still the American position. What the Soviets have done is to accept, quote, in principle, unquote, that position. They have not been willing to elaborate on it with us, however.
Thank you. Yes.
That's absolutely right. You're absolutely correct. It was a 1984 proposal by then Vice President George Bush, setting forth in detail what the United States was willing to do with regard to verification and inspection. It did, in fact, break a logjam that had been there for years. Foreign Minister Shevardnadze quickly picked up on it and gave the negotiations a further boost when he essentially endorsed them, although it took them a while to get around to the final endorsement. But I do think I realize I'm speaking against U.S. policy here, but I'll be very blunt about it. I don't believe that anybody really believes that the American proposals are going to be accepted by even the United States. The Soviets will tell you, if you ask them, that it seems like the United States is having a hard time accepting its own proposals. The United States has agreed to this inspection regime of anytime, anywhere, and then, I mean, it's no secret to specialists that some members of the intelligence community have retroactively expressed extreme concerns about the full implications of that, and that I think it's an open secret in Geneva that the United States is, doing a very slow crab walk away from those proposals. While they may be the official ones on the table, I don't think anyone really believes they're going to be the ones that are finally adopted. I think the United States, in effect, let this one out of the corral too early, said anytime, anywhere, and then only later did people in the intelligence community fully understand the implications of that. And I would stand by that based on numerous conversations with numerous diplomats in Geneva who say that the United States is sending signals, in every way it can, that this is, a matter for negotiation, and that, members of the United States delegation are making it clear that, they don't fully expect those proposals to be implemented. Whereas the Soviets now are stressing, and again, it may be a negotiating tactic, that they want those proposals that the United States originally introduced in 1984. And I personally think it brings a little bit of disrespect upon us when we come out with a proposal which we don't believe is a serious one. Now some people argue, well, that's negotiations, that's diplomacy, that you in effect stake out a position and let other people, respond to it and react to it, and you end up with something that's a compromise. To me, it doesn't really sell well for the United States to put out a proposal it really doesn't want. But I agree that, we have a disagreement on that.
This gentleman first.
Yes, Robin Ranger, United States Institute of Peace. This is a question for clarification for the record. Speaks to Joe to a point you made, but I think others will probably be able to comment usefully on it. You made a statement, which I would agree with, that the available evidence, and you of course have had access to classified information as well, indicates that the Soviets did indeed engage in large-scale use of chemical weapons, possibly limited use of biological weapons, and also transferred these certainly to other governments in the 1970s and early 1980s. As you know, though, this is a very contentious issue in the policy-making community and in the scholarly community. My fellow panelist this afternoon, Elisa Harris, has written an extremely long article in International Security arguing that the evidence is not convincing of Soviet CW and BW use and is not convincing of the Soviet release of anthrax, which I think very much relates to Gary Thatcher's points on anthrax, are not convincing. So I wonder if, for the record, you and your colleagues would like to clarify the nature and convincingness of this evidence, and also perhaps if Gary Thatcher could comment on how the evidence now looks in light of the very, very extensive research interviews which he conducted for that splendid series in the Christian Science Monitor.
Gentlemen, if you can make your responses brief, because you only have a short time, and this gentleman has been standing for a long time and is entitled to ask a question.
The statements I made with respect to the use of these weapons in Southeast Asia and Afghanistan are the primary sources of documentation on that, of course, are two State Department reports. I think it was number 98 and 101 or something like that, that dealt with the basic evidence that had been accumulated at that time. Since that time, of course, there have been major efforts to discredit those reports by numerous people, referring to it as bee-dung and everything else, which most people are familiar with. To the best of my knowledge, the government position is the correct position, and it's just that they haven't gone public. People have other things to do than to respond to a bee-dung theory all the time. I did not make any statements on BW transfer or BW use. I haven't heard of any BW use in either of those two situations. We do have this afternoon, however, a person that knows a great deal more about that area than I do, I'm sure, Gary Crocker, and maybe he could address it at that time. I think he's done the majority of work within the government.
I guess I'm going to be the odd man out on a lot of things today, but I did not rely extensively on the 1979 Sverdlovsk incident in my research. Here's what I concluded after studying everything I could on it, that there clearly was a major, I'm sorry, if we're talking in sort of symbols that a lot of you don't understand, just quick background. 1979 major outbreak of anthrax in the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk. The United States alleged that this was a result of an accidental release of anthrax in an aerosol form, which killed, who knows how many people. Here's what I concluded. I concluded that there in fact was a major outbreak of anthrax in Sverdlovsk in 1979 because the Soviets have now conceded this fact. I also found that in help me on this one if I'm wrong, but I believe it was 2 years ago where we had a review of the Biological Weapons Convention. At the experts meeting, the Soviets declared their facilities where research was being conducted under the terms of the Biological Weapons Convention, and one of those facilities was in Sverdlovsk. I consider myself a reasonable person, and so I conclude that there is a Soviet biological research facility in Sverdlovsk which uses anthrax, and that there was an outbreak in 1979. I haven't seen personally the evidence that makes the leap that says that the anthrax outbreak was unquestionably the result of an accidental outbreak at the facility. I'm unconvinced by the Soviet claims that, oh, well, this is a different total facility, it's in a different part of town, don't worry about this, guys. On the other hand, the case to me has not been made publicly enough that clearly that was the cause. I went to an extensive Soviet presentation done on this last year where they brought slides and autopsy reports and everything else. And I find it pretty unconvincing, frankly. I think they showed a lot of slides of anthrax victims and gave an argument that could possibly be true that this was a result of contaminated meat. But I wasn't convinced. Neither am I convinced by the evidence that the U.S. government has made publicly. So I basically have to leave that in the area of, it looks very suspicious, but until either side comes up with more evidence than we've seen so far, I did not rely on it extensively in my research for proving the case one way or the other. Sorry.
Yes, sir.
I'm Douglas Strusan. I'm visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. We've heard a great deal this morning about threats from the delivery of chemical and biological agents by ballistic missiles. And the statement has been made that there is no defense against ballistic missiles. And that, of course, is not true. I don't think that anyone questions that the Soviet Union has the system for the protection of Moscow, which is permitted under the ABM Treaty. I think a great many people, including some in this room, believe that the Soviets have made far greater progress in ballistic missile defense than the treaty might permit. We also, I think, know that the Israelis have an ongoing anti-ballistic missile program going called the Arrow. And this is certainly, I think, intended to deal with the new threat, and to which the chemical warheads, which the weapons which Israel's enemies might choose to use, would have adds point. I think that the threat of chemical and biological weapons, which might be delivered by missiles which might not come over the pole, is a reason for an additional incentive for the United States to explore strategic defense, and that we should perhaps be thinking less about putting this beast back in its cage, since we have heard, I think fairly convincingly this morning, that the beast is out or very close to being there, and creating systems and mechanisms by which we could cope with its attempt to pounce, rather than hoping against hope for some form of international arrangement. And if anyone who spoke this morning would like to comment, I would welcome it.
Any comments by? All right, we're going to break now. There will be a lunch, and then we will reconvene to hear the ambassador. I have one announcement, a message for Cheryl Parrott. Please call Lieutenant Manning. Is Cheryl Parrott here? Ladies and gentlemen, to begin our afternoon program, we are very privileged to have as our luncheon speaker His Excellency Rawdon Dalrymple, the Ambassador of Australia. Australia is the leader of the Australian group of countries that is engaged in multilateral effort to stop the ominous spread of chemical and biological weapons. The Ambassador has been his country's chief envoy to the United States since 1985. His career in the Australian Foreign Service has spanned 3 decades, including various assignments in Bonn, London, Manila, Jakarta. In 1972, he was appointed the Ambassador to Israel. Returning to Canberra in late 1975, he held senior positions in the Department of External Affairs until his appointment as the Ambassador to Indonesia in 1981, a post he held until 1985. The Australian Embassy in Jakarta is that country's 3rd largest and is regarded as one of its most important. The Ambassador was educated at Oxford in England, and in 1952 he was selected as a Rhodes Scholar for the state of New South Wales. In 1987, Ambassador Dalrymple was named the officer in the Order of Australia. We are pleased to welcome His Excellency F. Rawdon Dalrymple.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hollander. I'd like to thank Birith for the honour that you've done me and Australia by offering this opportunity to give you our thoughts about a major problem confronting governments, large, medium and small, all around the world. This is no mere rhetorical point. I recall that our then Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, when he received your gold medal in 1980, said, "You represent an organisation which has demonstrated the seriousness of its concern for human dignity and justice over the years. Unfortunately, human dignity and the right to live free from the terror of chemical warfare are being eroded by the spread of the chemicals, the equipment, the plants, and the technology for making chemical weapons. I'd like to explain to you today why Australia is so involved in efforts to halt this spread, and in parallel efforts to rid the world of these ghastly weapons for all time and in all environments. I should start by congratulating the B'nai B'rith for putting this unsavoury but topical subject on its agenda and organising a full-day seminar on it. Issues relating to chemical weapons are not glamorous or intriguing aspects of diplomacy, but they are urgent, threatening and growing in importance. There is always a temptation for international diplomacy to sweep difficult and unpleasant problems under the carpet. One of the lessons of the multifarious barbarities of the 20th century is that the only way to deal with such problems is to confront them openly and with determination. Why is chemical warfare, why are chemical weapons so horrible? It can be argued, and it is argued by some military professionals, that the form of weapon used in war is irrelevant. Only its efficiency and battlefield effectiveness count. This attitude seems to us in Australia to be too glib. CW is different because it is perceived to be different. Its nature, slow, silent, indiscriminate, killing or maiming military and civilians alike, arouses deep psychological aversion. Some have argued that this aversion stems from the atavistic fear of asphyxiation, which causes some of the primary impulses in human beings. For many, and in particular, I think of the thousands of Australian troops who were casualties of poison gas in World War I, the horror of chemical weapons arises directly from the immediate memories of the Flanders fields and other chemical battles. For whatever reason, however, there is no doubt that there is a special dimension, even a political dimension, to chemical warfare that does not attach to conventional weapons. Perhaps it is also a revulsion at individual governments exploiting the benefits of scientific and technological advances, which we expect to be put to good use on behalf of the whole of mankind. This disturbing diversion of intellectual endeavour to aberrant ends is caught in the chilling encomium of these weapons as a higher form of killing by one of the early architects of chemical warfare. Unfortunately, in one sense, the industrial revolutions which produced so many stunning advances also gave us the capability to produce the modern versions of chemical weapons. Chemical weapons are cheap, easy to make, and hard to defend against. These are relevant considerations for a country like Australia, since much of our nation lies in a tropical environment where defences would be especially burdensome. Even worse, the informal but largely effective norms against CW, which grew out of the horrors of World War I and which were embodied in the Geneva Protocol of 1925, are being eroded. While these norms largely held for the period 1918 to 1980, with a few exceptions, the past decade has seen the massive use of chemical warfare and its acquisition by a number of countries. The precise number of proliferants can be debated, but the trend is unambiguous. At its root the problem of the spread of chemical weapons is a political problem. We are witnessing the clear, deliberate calculation by certain countries that they want chemical weapons and will take whatever steps are necessary if they can to get them. The effort against the spread of chemical weapons must be primarily a political and diplomatic effort. There is no technical fix. Fortunately, the past 19 years have seen quiet but steady work being done to reach effective ways to ban these weapons. This international effort draws on the earlier work that led to the 1925 protocol, and it aims to go beyond that protocol, to provide a convention banning altogether the development, production, stockpile, transport and use of chemical weapons. It also provides for the supervised destruction of existing stocks. Since 1978, this work in the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva has grown in importance and advanced in its content. A seminal point was a tabling in 1984 by the then Vice President Bush of a complete text of a draft treaty. That major development has improved the work of the conference. With a new Soviet approach in recent years, there has been quite rapid progress to the point where most of the major conceptual issues and many of the details have been resolved. There is, however, a considerable amount of technical details still awaiting resolution. Mr. Chairman, I need hardly tell an audience such as this that no treaty in and of itself will change politico-military realities. The treaty can embody political decisions already taken, and it can create norms that over time gain widespread acceptance and authority. Obviously, the very act of adhering to a treaty represents a political commitment, and it is in itself a valuable asset against the further spread of chemical weapons. But we need to have more than that. To be truly useful, the treaty must have intrusive and elaborate verification provisions. These provisions are now being developed in Geneva and will be uniquely complex. They will be not only indicators of a commitment to the purposes of the treaty, they will also be guarantees of the integrity of the treaty. Now, as I said, no treaty binds except with ropes of paper. But that is true of all treaties. We want a treaty that holds together also because its adherents see that it gives them something really worthwhile, furthering their own interests. In other words, it must offer an enhanced and more stable security environment. The treaty must be adequately verifiable to give assurances to its parties that all have gained from the removal of the threat of chemical weapons. The treaty must also be workable. If its provisions are too prescriptive and rigid, it will simply not work, and the international chemical industry will simply not cooperate. At the heart of the negotiations, therefore, is the intensely difficult but compelling task of finding the right balance between security benefits and commercial realities, which also addresses the risks of chemical warfare proliferation without the treaty and the risks of creating and the risk of cheating under an imperfectly designed and monitored regime. Australia believes that those judgments are close to resolution, that the negotiations in Geneva are close to success. Specifically, we are confident that a treaty capable of attracting very broad support, as it will need to do, will emerge in the foreseeable future, perhaps within 2 years. Mr. Chairman, one of the unforeseen but important events, one of the unforeseen but important benefits of negotiating such a complex treaty, the current version of the rolling text is over 150 pages, whereas the 1925 protocol was less than 1 page, is that a dialogue has been stimulated between governments and their national chemical industries. This dialogue will need to be intensified and developed. In order to do that, the Australian Foreign Minister, Senator Gareth Evans, announced on 6 March that Australia would host a major international conference later this year designed to bring together governments and their chemical industries in a working conference and to discuss the problem of the diversion of chemical feedstocks, equipment, plant and technology for chemical weapons purposes. Because this conference essentially brings together the industrialists who have the relevant technology and governments with a direct interest, there is some concern that it will form a focus for current neutral and non-aligned and third world suspicion that existing chemical warfare possessors and industrialised states are endeavouring to set up a discriminatory regime which would deny chemical weapons to other countries, inhibit the transfer of chemical equipment, know-how and feedstocks to developing countries, thus thwarting their legitimate industrial development, and preserve existing CW stocks, particularly in the arsenals of the superpowers. So let me make it perfectly clear that the conference is aimed at facilitating the achievement of a global ban on chemical weapons, involving the destruction of existing stocks and preventing the development of new stocks. One clear potential obstacle to the full and effective implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention is the fact that there is still an incomplete appreciation throughout the international chemical industry of the role of industry in addressing the chemical weapons problem. As Australia's consultations with our own domestic chemical industry have shown, it's only through practical dialogue between government and industry as working partners that effective measures can be taken. Worldwide, this sort of dialogue is an essential prerequisite for the effective implementation of a fully comprehensive chemical weapons ban. The proposed government industry conference in Australia is intended to fill this significant gap. There is no existing mechanism for governments and international industry to work together on this issue. We hope that the conference will also act as the catalyst in creating that vital link of a practical dialogue between individual governments and their national industries. Because without that link, the aims of the CW Convention could not be translated into an effective regime. The conference was conceived and is being planned as an activity fully supportive of a global, comprehensive CW Convention. Let me describe now another separate initiative which Australia has also pursued vigorously, that of export controls on chemical weapons precursors. As evidence of Iraq's use of chemical weapons grew in the mid-1980s, Australian scientists set to work to determine contents of Iraq's shopping list and the likely development of their chemical weapons program. In 1985, we in Australia introduced export controls on 8 chemicals, expanding that list to 30 2 years later as our understanding of the program grew. Australia also convened meetings of other OECD countries, including the EC12 and the United States, mindful that export controls are only effective if there are no obvious gaps and if those countries participating are confident they will not be undercut by a more ambitious and less principled trading nation. As I commented earlier, one outcome of the coordination work on the Chemical Weapons Convention and export controls has been to stimulate dialogue between governments and within countries, which is part of the long process of building and reinforcing political norms. But the spread of chemical weapons is an urgent problem. Some would claim that export controls have not been a success. Just look at Libya. To which we respond that the very nature of chemicals and the chemical industry, the ease with which mustard gas can be made, for example, mean that legislative controls cannot and should not be a substitute for responsibility. Responsibility that is based on self-interest in realising that chemical warfare is a game in which there are no winners in the long term. The size and complexity of the chemical industry mean that it has to be a partner in this effort. It's the only way. The introduction of export controls in Australia has demonstrated to industry that the government is serious in working towards chemical disarmament, and that there is a determination behind the ominous greeting, "We're from the government and we are here to help you." Australia's export control system was designed together with industry to minimise disruption to legitimate commerce. So efficient is it that export applications are received by fax and processed within 48 hours. Industry's experience in this exercise has helped to convince them of the government's real concern to strike a balance between arms control efforts and legitimate commercial interests. That lesson is one which can help Australia move swiftly and effectively in implementing the future Chemical Weapons Convention. Mr. Chairman, Australia has also taken other interim measures to try to control the spread of chemical weapons. We are currently engaged in implementing an initiative which our Prime Minister, Mr. Hawke, announced in June 1988 at the Asia Society in New York. That effort is directed at discussing with our neighbours the security problem which chemical weapons pose for our region, how best to avoid it, and how to prepare for the Chemical Weapons Convention. So far, we have had quite extensive bilateral discussions with Southeast Asian governments. Next month, we will be talking in detail with South Pacific nations. The response to our efforts so far has been very positive. But we need to take further the growing consensus within our region that we are all better off without chemical weapons. To build on and strengthen the accord we have struck in our initial discussions with our neighbours, Australia has proposed a regional seminar where policy advisors can look together at our shared security environment and the negative impact that chemical weapons would have on it, and where a common understanding can be reached on the implications of a global CW convention for our region. Illustrating that this is truly a collective effort, Indonesian Foreign Minister Alatas has joined the Australian government to co-host this workshop later in the year. In talking about the role that Australia is playing to control the spread of chemical weapons, I should emphasise that the international framework in which we are operating is, to a very significant part, determined by the political decisions of the superpowers. But here there is very good news indeed. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Bush tabled a full draft treaty at the Conference on Disarmament. During the 1988 campaign, he described as his solemn mission the complete and total ban on these weapons, their destruction forever. President Bush will not find a stronger or more vigorous ally than Australia in pursuit of that goal. And it is also noteworthy that under Mr. Gorbachev, there has been a real substantive evolution of Soviet policy. Soviets have for the first time revealed details of the CW holdings, opened up for inspection parts of their CW arsenals, and undertaken to commence the destruction of their chemical weapons. When taken together with Secretary Baker's announcement in Vienna earlier this month of the advanced schedule for the withdrawal of United States CW stockpiles assigned to NATO, it is hard not to believe that the major powers are taking real steps to CW arms control and disarmament. But the active involvement of the superpowers, while necessary, is not enough. As I said earlier, CW is cheap and simple to make. So we have to concentrate on comprehensive involvement in the efforts to outlaw chemical weapons. This means that third world countries need to be involved. And it is a sad thought that since 1918, all reported uses of CW have been in third world countries. It has been said, somewhat obtusely and misleadingly, that chemical weapons are a poor man's atomic bomb. Truth to tell, chemical weapons are a poor people's scourge, as the villagers of Halabja in northern Iraq learned a year ago. The involvement of the third world in chemical weapons prompts me to raise a matter of particular concern to the B'nai B'rith, the potential for a chemical threat to Israel. At the Paris International Conference in January of this year, a number of nations argued that the nuclear capacity they believed Israel to possess could justify a chemical threat against Israel. Australia rejects that argument. We see it as in all countries' interests to break the destabilising chain of a perceived threat justifying the production of an actual threat. We urge Israel to forswear any nuclear ambitions and join the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And we emphatically declare that there can be no justification for a chemical weapons threat to Israel. Equally, it is our conviction that Israel's security would ultimately only be impaired if it were to acquire a chemical weapons capacity. This would further undermine the moral and legal constraints against CW proliferation and could be seized upon as a justification for further CW arsenals. Rather, it seems to us, Israel's security and the security environment of the whole Middle East stands to be improved by a credible, verifiable ban on chemical weapons. Mr. Chairman, if the efforts to find effective barriers against the spread of chemical weapons do not succeed, we may well see quite soon a world characterised by many states possessing CW and many with a well-developed capacity to move quickly in that direction. We shall then all be forced to rely on a variety of defensive and deterrent postures, with all that that implies in democratic societies where the deep-seated aversion to these weapons will be articulated and action demanded. On the other hand, we have very close at hand the prospect of a world where there is a process of universal CW disarmament and an institutionalised restraint on the spread of these horrible weapons. We also